Hello and welcome back to Cooking the Books with me, Gilly Smith, the podcast which takes us through 4 food moments from the books of our favourite food writers. It's about all of life through the prism of food. And this week, we've been invited to a Chinese banquet with the word on Chinese food, Fuchsia Dunlop.
If you look at how Western companies and chefs are really trying to think of creative ways to make plant-based food satisfying, to eat less meat, and to use things like insects and jellyfish, well, the Chinese have so many ideas that the world could share.
Fuchsia's multi-award-winning book, Invitation to a Banquet, is huge and a deep dive into Chinese life through the prism of food. After 30 years of writing about Chinese food culture, she has a seat at the table most of us can never join. I asked her if she was opening the door to that dining room for us to have a better look at a whole culture we may have massively misunderstood.
Well, I think that one of the ironies about Chinese food is that it's so widely loved and appreciated all over the world, but the people don't really understand it, and they just see such a tiny snapshot of what Chinese food can be. And yes, I suppose I am, but it's particularly when I take other foreigners around China, which is what I'm actually doing now, and just see how they cannot believe the food they're being served at every meal, and the variety, the diversity, the fact that when you travel from one place to another, it's almost like going to another country in European terms. And also that it's so technically ingenious and complex. And as you say, it's just this whole world. And so to a certain extent, I've been living it for so many years now, and I am used to it. But I myself am often amazed again by something that I come across, by a whole new regional cuisine. So it never stops to be amazing, yes.
We know that the food of China changes from region to region, like it does in many countries, but this is on a different level. This feels to me like a different universe, a different paradigm. It feels like you've landed on a different planet where everything is different. The way that you talk about food opens that door of perception, doesn't it? It's into a way of thinking, a whole cultural framework that is unrecognisable. We'll dig much, much deeper into what you're talking about, the differences in the food. But how different is the cultural sensibility of China?
Well, gosh, I mean, I think one thing to remember, which I often sort of remind myself of, is that Chinese people talk a lot about the West and about Xichan, Western food, and they make whopping great generalizations about it and sometimes dismiss it by saying that it's very simple and very monotonous. And obviously, from a Western point of view, you think, hang on there. I mean, the West, you're talking about so many different countries and places. And it's a bit like that when we talk about China and about Chinese food. So yes, there's a whole different way of looking at food, of eating, a whole different sensibility, and that extends into other things. And I think that learning to appreciate Chinese food is a way into appreciating much more than just the food. Aesthetics, values, a whole different culture. I mean, that's what it's done for me. And that's, I think also that's the joy of food writing, isn't it? That you can talk about so many things beyond just what's on the table. Although that's interesting enough in itself.
Well, it is. And I'd love to talk a lot more. I mean, there's so much in this book. I was thinking, how on earth am I going to get all this into 30 minutes? We are going to try. I mean, let me take one of those. Gong fu. You talk about it as a culinary virtuosity that can be applied to any demanding skill. And that's really interesting in itself. Something has to be a challenge in the first place. But it also has a spiritual and philosophical dimension to it, like martial arts, for example. And you apply that to cooking. So of all the many, many, many things that you talk about, let's just dive into that.
Well, let's take knife work as an example. That the Chinese have for at least about 2,000 years been eating food that's cut into small pieces with chopsticks. And that's one of the defining characteristics of Chinese food. And of course, if you have your food cut very finely, then knife skills have a particular importance in the cuisine. When I was training as a chef, the absolutely fundamental skill was how to use a cleaver. I mean, it's actually lighter knife than a cleaver, but it's one of these broad blade, Chinese knives. and to use it in so many different ways to transform food into slivers and slices, and with different names and shapes. And so there are all kinds of aspects to that. There are aesthetic aspects, to have a dish that's beautiful because every ingredient is cut into similar fine slivers. It just looks lovely on the plate. There's a harmony in the mouth with all these strandy textures. And also there's a technical aspect because, for example, with stir frying, which is high heat, very fast cooking method, that the food has to be evenly cut if it's to be properly cooked. Because if you have very uneven, say, slices of meat, then the thinner ones will be overcooked by the time the thicker ones have reached the point of perfection. So there's a technical aspect. And so a chef, usually with this very simple instrument, just a single knife, not like the whole battery of French knives, different shapes and sizes, cuts the food into pieces. And there is extraordinary virtuosity in a good knife chef. And some places are famous for their knife skills, like Yangzhou, which is not far from Shanghai, where chefs can cut a block of silken tofu into hair-like threads that sort of separate in a broth and look like a beautiful subterranean flower. And there is an idea that cutting is also a metaphor for the kind of mastery that you would show in the martial arts, for example. And there's an ancient text, the Zhuangzi, an ancient Taoist text, where there's an absolutely beautiful description of Chef Ding butchering an ox. And there's this amazing poetic description of the chef using his knife to find the spaces between the bones. So cutting up this ox is completely effortless, a sort of ballet of knife work. And so that's what I mean by Kung Fu cooking. And the Chinese use the word Kung Fu, to describe very elaborate dishes that require a lot of labour and time to realise.
And there's a reason for it, isn't there? Like their approach to the martial arts. This is an almost sort of spiritual experience, isn't it? And the provenance of that ox, for example, there'd be a real respect for its masculinity, for example, its strength, its purpose on the land. So there's a whole other dimension to why to eat rather than just how to cut it up.
Yes, yeah. And the idea, I mean, many Chinese ancient philosophers used food and cooking as a metaphor for the most important things in life. Like Lao Tzu famously compared governing a great country to cooking small fish. Delicate, subtle matter. Confucius is said to have refused to eat food that wasn't properly cut. So food was something that just resonated with people in China even thousands of years ago. And I think still today, food is one of the means by which Chinese people, both in China and abroad, really express themselves and their culture.
And this isn't just a sort of a class thing. It is so ingrained in Chinese people over thousands and thousands of years. The culture is so strong that it is beyond class. And we'll talk a lot in a minute about, the importance of using everything in the animal, on the fish, in the vegetable, because a lot of people have been very poor. But this is not about class. It's not about showing off. It's not about aspiration and all the other the reasons we eat the way we do, perhaps in the West.
Well, I think it can be. So you can definitely have show-off food, which the famous 18th century gourmet writer Yuan Mei called it food for the eyes, was food that was simply flashy and designed to impress. But yes, it cuts through all classes and all sections of society. And there is a sort of joy in food and a desire to talk about it at all levels of society, and also extreme skill and craft. So you sometimes meet street vendors who are making some kind of pastry that they've developed, which is very technical and very complicated. And they're just selling it for a few yuan on the street of a Chinese city.
Yeah, I interviewed Michael Z a couple of weeks back, and he was talking about breakfast and how most people will go out for breakfast. In fact, everyone will go out for breakfast because they don't really have kitchens in most places, most homes in China. But it is part of the culture to eat out, and that's from the poorest to the richest.
Well, I think that's the thing. I mean, they do cook at home. But yes, China has a restaurant culture, and that's one of the reasons that the cuisine is so diverse and variegated, really. That, for example, in 13th century Hangzhou, this city near Shanghai that I really love, they had an absolutely thriving restaurant scene. Yeah, in the 13th century, with all different kinds of restaurants, and restaurants with very fine and extravagant crockery, and restaurants with art on the walls and menus, but also street food of all different kinds. There are these absolutely mouth-watering lists of snacks and dishes served in all the different sorts of restaurants in the city. And yes, and you have in today's China everything from really casual hole-in-the-wall places where you can go for your delicious breakfast tofu or some steamed buns or whatever, to extraordinary high-level restaurants with grand private rooms and incredible service and some elements of performance with people coming in and cooking bits of your meal, singing songs, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, you've been there for a long time now, off and on. You went there first when you went to take a 3-month chef's training course at the Sichuan Higher Institute of Cuisine. Before that, you'd been a kind of a journalist, a sub-editor, hadn't you? Tell me about that, because you were at Cambridge, you were doing English literature, which accounts for the beautiful writing that is really what you use to communicate these extraordinary sort of depths, I think, of what Chinese food is all about to you. But it is this kind of journalism that sort of drives you as the observer. What does that observer tell you now, after decades of living there, about what we can learn from Chinese food culture?
Well, a great deal, yes. And I think particularly that Westerners, with this sort of affection for Chinese food, have also often been very dismissive of it and have seen it as being, cheap everyday food, tasty, but nothing that you would pay a lot of money for. And also, I think the most ridiculous stereotype of Chinese food in Western sort of minds is often that it's very unhealthy, because people associate it with tasty deep fried takeout food with really strong, sweet, salty sauces and that kind of thing. And also there are negative stereotypes around the idea of the Chinese eating everything, the idea that there's something weird about eating chicken's feet, or a very excessive focus on eating shark's fins, which have become a rather unsustainable food. And I think that, the unhealthy stereotype is completely ridiculous, because I don't think there's any other culture in the world probably that is as obsessed with the link between diet and health as the Chinese. There's a saying, 药食同源, food and medicine come from the same source, and food and diet have been seen as the foundation of maintaining good health for, more than 2,000 years, very strongly ingrained in Chinese history. And I think also this focus, so sure, shark's fins have become an unsustainable food, but so have eels, and so has beef when it results in the raising of, Brazilian rainforests. We all eat unsustainably. And I think beyond that, you can look at Chinese food as an absolute model of healthy and balanced eating because of these ideas of how to eat well. So in China, good food is about food that makes you feel good as well as taste incredible. And also, I think that this eating everything, this imaginative exploitation of all kinds of unlikely ingredients, is a real model for sustainability in our environmental crisis, of the modern age. And so there are many ingredients, for example, nose-to-tail eating, that when Western chefs do it, it's very lauded and very fashionable and so on. Chinese chefs just do this very naturally and so on. And so, yes, I think if you look at how Western companies and chefs are really trying to think of creative ways to make plant-based food satisfying, to eat less meat, and to use things like insects and jellyfish, well, the Chinese have so many ideas that the world could share. Yeah.
And it's more than that. It's what you write about in the book. It's the culture. It's the attitude of eating everything, no waste. It is about eating together. And, it's all the things that we've lost our connection with in the West. It was a really fascinating conversation, actually. But let's go into your first food moment, because it's very much about, you use sweet and sour pork balls. And my goodness, I grew up on this. The kind of the Chinese takeaway, the typical idea of what British people think of as Chinese food. Why have you chosen that one as your first food moment?
Well, I think because it was the starting point of getting to know Chinese food for so many people of my generation. And that is to say, it was something that I absolutely adored as a child, and actually ordered recently from a local Chinese takeaway in London and found it was still really delicious. Chinese food was a real treat when I was growing up. And yet what that kind of Chinese food was so far removed from what Chinese people actually ate. And so for me, it's a really good symbol of the way that a certain kind of Cantonese food that was developed by resourceful immigrants from the Cantonese south of China to satisfy the palates of suspicious and sometimes hostile Westerners has shaped perceptions of Chinese food. And for a long time, many people thought that Chinese food was chop suey and chow mein, fried noodles, always fried food, and so on. And while it's certainly true that that is changing a lot, and now we have more regional food, there are Sichuanese restaurants all over the place now and other regional cuisines. And I think perceptions are really being shaken up. We're still at a fairly basic starting point in understanding this huge culinary culture.
Well, for example, I wouldn't eat pork balls now because I wouldn't trust the provenance of the pork. But in China, you say that pork is the main meat. And again, this relationship with where the animal comes from, the life that it's led, is hugely important. You talk a lot about terroir, which we understand. You talk about local and seasonal as the absolute bottom line in Chinese food culture. But what about the provenance? What about factory farmed animals?
Oh, well, I think, in modern China, there is plenty of junk food. There is increasing factory farming, and they're facing many of the same environmental and health and social problems that we are in other countries as a result of a rapidly industrializing diet. But I think what's really interesting is that all these ideas about the importance of a good diet and balance, healthy eating, and about the close connection between good terroir and the finest food and eating in season, that all these ideas are very much part of the DNA of Chinese culture. And I think that and people in China who care about food and can afford to be picky, as, wealthy people in the West can, will always gravitate towards food that is properly produced. They call 绿色食品, green food products. There's a real market for it. And just as people in the West, as diets got more industrialized, started craving more natural food, reliable, trustworthy, pure, food. The same thing goes for China. And I think that in some ways, one might argue that the Chinese have an advantage in dealing with these problems because the importance of food is so deeply ingrained in their culture.
Yeah. I think what you said about it being so much in their DNA means that it will snap back, whereas we've lost the connection for so long. It's hundreds of years since we had a good, realistic connection with food. That it's difficult for us to remember how to eat, which is, I think, one of the reasons that we've become this UPF generation. But your second food moment is actually about the joy of Chinese vegetables, and this is very much about how everybody eats. This goes back thousands of years as well, doesn't it? The ability to cook a fresh and healthy vegetable within season is key to how everybody eats.
Yes, I think, so the dish that I chose for this one was Anji bamboo shoots with Chinese ham, and it's a dish from a restaurant that has been a very big influence on me for the last 15 years. The owner, Dai Jianjun, has sort of literally fed me with the history of the Jiangnan region and helped me to understand so much. And this is a restaurant which absolutely insists on the freshest, most seasonal ingredients. And Anji as in Anji bamboo shoots, is the name of a place with bamboo forests. So wonderful bamboo shoots. And this dish is incredibly simple. It's just bamboo shoots, which are blanched and then woked with a bit of ham and a bit of stock to give them some lovely umami flavours. And that's typical, really, of the emphasis on just making the most of good produce, which is, again, something that people in the West don't often connect with Chinese food. And it's just, by extension, one of the most revelatory things for me as a young foreigner living in China, discovering Chinese food, was how fresh and healthy it was and how people ate so many fresh seasonal vegetables. And, you go to a market in Shanghai and you have all these beautiful, fresh seasonal greens, kinds of brassica cabbagey family that we don't have, much smaller and more delicate, and all kinds of other vegetables with their own flavours, and they're part of almost every meal, and they're not only eaten, but they're cooked so beautifully. And I think that certainly for older generations of British people, vegetables are often something that you would eat out of duty. Boiled cabbage, they were vegetables on the side, they were rather plain, and the focus was on the main dish. And in China, vegetables are cooked so deliciously that you really want to eat them. Like in the last week, I've had some amazing stir-fried cabbage with Chinese vinegar and scorched chilies. Absolutely delicious. And also cabbage cooked with little bits of fatty pork. Scrumptious again. So, you're eating a little bit of meat to give flavour to a whole plateful of cabbage. And then also at lunch today, we had some, they're called jimao cai, chicken feather greens, tiny, tiny little sort of pak choy type greens, which are just very quickly woked. So just kissed by heat, little bit of salt, practically nothing else. And they're so juicy and delicious. And so I think that for example, in Britain, the government's always trying to get people to eat the 5-a-day vegetables. Well, we could all learn from Chinese cooks on how to do this in a way that's really not very complicated and is very satisfying to the senses.
Yeah, and that doesn't just grow on land. You say that the Chinese grow on the sky, the land and the water.
I think what it is that you have, for example, fruit picked from trees, you could say that's in the sky, and regular vegetables growing all over the land. But also in China, there's this whole genre of water vegetables. I mean, I think in England, we pretty much just eat watercress, right? But in China, you have water chestnuts, water caltrops, water bamboo, water shield, water celery, vegetables with very intriguing tastes and juicy textures and lovely slippery mouthfeel in some cases. And it's just part of the beauty of connecting you with the landscape and I mean, that's something particularly in the Jiangnan region around Shanghai, where there are lakes and rivers and streams, and you have all these watery foods. Not just that, but also lots of freshwater creatures. So not just fish, but eels and little crabs and shrimps. Utterly delicious.
Yeah, and in fact, the net result is that Chinese people eat so much more, but more interestingly. And, your third food moment comes from the chapter which I chose as well for one of my food moments for you. What is an ingredient? And that's such an interesting question. What is edible is what that's really all about. How can I make this edible is the key to understanding Chinese cuisine. You've chosen braised pomelo pith with dried shrimp eggs because you say it rethinks the old stereotype of the Chinese eat everything. Yes, they do, but with dazzling creativity and technical ingenuity. Of all the many, many things, I was thinking you were going to get the carp tail in here somewhere, but you've chosen this one. Tell me why.
So this is one of my favourite Cantonese dishes. Now, pomelo pith, that giant citrus fruit. So this is just the cottony layer under the skin. Most people would just throw it in the bin. It's colourless, it's just taste. I mean, why would you eat this? And yet, Cantonese cooks have thought of a way of soaking it for a long time, repeatedly changing the water and squeezing it and rinsing it to remove any bitterness and plucking away any stringy bits, and then cooking it in this opulent stock made of chicken and pork and toasted fish to imbue it with all these marvellous flavours. And you end up with a dish where the pith becomes something soft and comforting, almost like mashed potato, but with a bit more shape, a bit more structure, in this absolutely delicious sauce sprinkled with toasted shrimp eggs. It's so delicious. And it just seems incredible to me that, who on earth thought of doing this to pomelo pith? And that was why I framed the question. Yes, I think for most people, we would ask the question, is this edible? But I think for the Chinese, the question is, how can I make this edible? How can I take this unlikely or unpromising ingredient and use imagination and culinary technique and supplementary ingredients and flavourings to make the most of its advantages and to sort of disappear its disadvantage and come up with something that's interesting. And this is something that you find throughout Chinese culture. So pomelo pith is a fairly rustic Cantonese dish, but you also get this at the highest levels. For example, I had a grand imperial dish in Beijing the other day, which was boned out duck feet in mustard sauce. Duck feet, again, most cultures, we don't really do much with them. But in China, from a Chinese point of view, you think, well, there's not much meat on them, but they have this lovely, slithery, crisp texture, very important in Chinese cuisine. And so you take them and you take out the bones, because this is an elegant imperial dish, and you sort of blanch them, remove any sort of unpleasant meaty flavour, and you end up with something that's more or less pure texture. And then you give it a punchy mustard sauce, and you have a very interesting and satisfying dish that it feels gorgeous in the mouth. So that's at the very highest level, and at the very rustic level, you have people cooking with imagination. And again, we get back to the idea that Chinese cuisine can be a model for sustainability, because we have to eat more resourcefully if we're going to stop destroying the planet.
One of the examples of how we can see China as a model for a solution for climate change is this mind bomb about soybean. The Chinese chose to turn soybean into tofu instead of feeding it to cows like the rest of the world. Mind bomb. Think about if the world chose soybean to eat instead of feeding it to the cows, decimating the Amazon rainforest, the factory farms. All the food that is fed to animals is pretty much soy, isn't it? And as a result, it helped to create the distinctive Chinese landscape, and it swelled the population, and it gave its cuisine its character. That is an enormous statement. Your fourth food moment is mapo tofu.
Well, I suppose that what's quite interesting is that until relatively recently, most Chinese people didn't eat much meat, and they scarcely ate dairy products at all. I mean, they've always been part of Chinese food culture, but very much a fringe part for most of Chinese history. And so what takes the place of eating a lot of meat and eating a lot of dairy in Chinese culture is the soybean. And this very unpromising, indigestible, anti-digestible little bean, when it is transformed either by making it into tofu or by fermentation, making it into soybeans and fermented soybeans and soy sauce and other really tasty relishes, you get this transformative ingredient, because soya contains all the amino acids needed by the human body in the right sort of proportions. And so, yes, and it's far more efficient use of land than growing lots of beans and feeding them to cattle. But the thing that's so interesting about Chinese food, I think, is that because there's always been this emphasis on sensory pleasure, on the delights of food, that Chinese cuisine offers ways of eating less meat without feeling you're depriving yourself at all. So there are plenty of dishes where you use meat stock or lard or small bits of meat, or dried shrimps, also fish and seafood, to give flavour to a bulk of vegetables. So they become nourishing. And sometimes you can also just use soy. I mean, like fermented black beans are delicious and they make vegetables seem more substantial. And mapo tofu, that famous Sichuanese dish named after a late 19th century woman restaurateur in the capital, Chengdu, is such a brilliant example, because I think a lot of Westerners for a long time thought of tofu as being a real sackcloth and ashes food for desperate vegetarians. You know, no one would really want to eat it. And mapo tofu, you have cubes of wobbling soft tofu cooked with a little bit of minced beef and these incredible fermented seasonings. So Sichuan chili and broad bean paste, fermented black beans, and then a final zing of Sichuan pepper. And so you have a dish where, I mean, just a little sprinkling of meat makes a dish that's satisfying for a group of people. And it gives all that richness to the tofu. And so this dish, and in my experience, it's the tofu dish that meat eaters love, that converts anyone to the possibilities of tofu. And so that is a prime example of what they call 肉边菜, so vegetables cooked meatily, where meat is a flavour principle and not the main deal. And so that, for me, has been one of the greatest lessons of learning how to cook Chinese food, is how to eat less meat for environmental and, you know, maybe compassionate reasons, but without feeling that you're depriving yourself because it's so insanely delicious.
How many words have you got for mouthfeel in the book? 30?
I can't remember, quite a lot. That was a preliminary list of ones that sprang to mind rather quickly.
Yeah, exactly. But most people who will read this book, it's absolutely fascinating, because as I say, it's a glimpse under the bonnet of a different world. But I'm never going to eat duck feet. I'm never going to eat cartilage, the carp tail. I am going to be interested in looking at the Chinese restaurants available to me in Chinatown. I'm never going to eat that kind of stuff.
Well, why not? You know, I would say, well, you could go for dim sum in London and eat chicken's feet, and you could have a jellyfish appetizer, which is one of these intriguing sort of tasteless texture ingredients, which is not at all frightening, really. I mean, it sounds very alien to Westerners, but it's actually, you know, people normally enjoy eating it. So you can dip your toes in the water without going to China.
All right, I will. I'm going for dim sum fairly soon. I will have a go and I will report back. But the point is that most people won't. And that's not necessarily the point of the book. It is an exploration of a different philosophy. And it is fascinating because actually this is an unknown culture. There's a lot of stranger danger feeling around China. It feels like we don't understand them, and that they are a superpower, and we are frightened of what is around the corner for China. Is this book helpful? Do you feel, as you did your masters at SOAS, you studied politics and culture, you're a journalist, you're an observer, you're a writer, you're a communicator. Is there some purpose there in showing that different doesn't necessarily mean frightening?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I suppose that I have had very enriching and wonderful experiences in China, and I have great friends there, and I have learnt so much, and I want to share that with people. And I think that it's always interesting to see different sides of the world, different cultures and so on. I wrote this book primarily really with the object of just talking about Chinese food and trying to give people a fresh look at Chinese food. But I have to say that the context in which I wrote it was the pandemic, with this upsurge in anti-Chinese animosity, and also with growing geopolitical tensions. And so I'm very aware, yes, that China is now seen as this big and slightly threatening rival on the international stage. And it's absolutely critical that we try to understand each other. A lot of Chinese students come and study in the West. There's a lot of traffic that way. And I think people in the West really need to get their heads around China as well. And also particularly to make a human connection and to see some of the wonderful things about the country and the culture, as well as the more threatening things. And I think this applies too, because Chinese food is not just the culture of China, the nation state. It's also the culture of the Chinese diaspora. And it's important for them too that people appreciate and respect Chinese culture. And I think that, yes, I just think that there's this context has made it feel timely and relevant in a way that I hadn't anticipated.
Thanks for listening. Head over to my Substack for extra bites of Fuchsia's China, and I'll see you next week.